was getting pretty popular, and we hosted the Winter Olympics in the region at Squaw Valley. And this is when the big rush started to build. Because now you have the Winter Olympics, people are skiing, there's the middle class, U.S. economy is booming, the industrial complex, one might call it, right, between the Soviet Union and the United States was developing. And of course, people wanted to come recreate up here at Lake Tahoe. Winter, so you guys all saw a little snow. In December, we had 5 meters of snow here, right? It's hard to imagine. We may have some Tuesday. Are you excited for that? This Tuesday. So what do you do when you want to ski? You build resorts. You build vacation areas. And this is one of the examples of that, bulldozing the watersheds, creating ski resorts, roads for houses. You might look at the watershed and see it looks like a forest, but it actually has a lot of road connections. So when you go onto Google Earth, if you look down, you actually see a lot of roads, not just forest. So what do you think this does to sediments and particles? Does it increase the particles and nutrients coming to the lake, or maintain it? Increase. Yeah, no problem. More impervious surfaces, more hard substrate, more runoff, we call it.
And less trees to hold on the soil.
Exactly, less sort of trees and plants to stabilize the runoff. Is this making sense, guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Doesn't it influence the rampant occurrence of forest fires?
At this point, this is the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Yes and no. No, because the climate dryness was not as extreme at that time. Number two is the federal government and the states had a prohibition on fires, so they put everything out very quickly. The amount of fires was less at that time. Today, this type of activity can either hinder or help fires. Like in South Lake Tahoe, this fire last September, it could be that some of this development actually blocks the rate of movement of the fire. It's a little more complex. So let's think about some early scientific investigations. This is my advisor who built that building that you were in yesterday at the Science Center. Charles Goldman comes up and he says, you know, he was young, he said, we still talk to him, I talked to him yesterday and for your trip, and he came in 1958 and started measuring the algal growth in the water, in the open water, meaning maybe 1,500 meters offshore. And he starts taking these measurements of algae growth, 1959, 67, 68, 69, 70, and he starts seeing algae is growing at a much faster rate than it did in 58. And so he started making these predictions. What would happen if you just continue to have development and growth? You had nutrients, and you had sediment, growing algae. And these are the types of algae you might see, really tiny microscopic diatoms if you're interested in the biology. Very cold water loving algae. And so what happened was Charles Goldman started these initial studies and then started raising the alarm saying, something is happening. To me, this is very exciting because this shows you the power of one or two individuals can make a big difference if you're willing to take a risk and tell people what's happening. And he started saying, the lake is changing quickly. It looks blue to you, but the algae you can see is growing in my bodies faster. And so one of the major milestones that they had, because up until this time, with all of the development that was occurring, maybe I'll ask you this. Where do you think our water goes? When you flush the toilet, where does the water go eventually?
Goes to the lake.
Huh?
Goes to the lake?
Yeah, it should go to the lake, right? All shit flows downhill is an expression we have in the U.S.
It increases the soil.
It can go into the soil, but where it goes into the soil, where does it go? To the lake.
Yeah.
Anything downhill, right?
Finally
Gravity.
to the lake.
Yeah.
Finally to the lake.
Yeah. Eventually, whenever you shit or poop, it goes to the lowest point.
So the lowest points here are covered with that lake.
And so that's historically how it was until these recognitions that the lake was changing. And so what they did is a major milestone occurred. They actually created sewage and sanitation projects in this very difficult watershed of mountains with snow and rock. And they collect all of the sewage and they move it over into the states of Nevada and parts of California and then down to Nevada. So everything that whenever you flush your toilet, you're actually taking water out of Lake Tahoe and moving it over the basin, over the watershed to the other side. So it doesn't go to the lake. This was a big deal, and this was done with some science data, with a lot of early advocacy of humans, like Julie, Director Regan talked about, by two governors, Reagan and Laxalt. Laxalt was the Nevada governor, Reagan was the California governor, and they said, look, we have to control the development, and we have to control the sewage. It's a problem. And they did it. This is one of the biggest infrastructure projects. You see it now in Colombia. They've done it in Colombia. We've tried to do it in Guatemala. We've seen it done all over the globe, in Switzerland, in Europe. These types of projects have occurred. They're not that complicated. So every time you flush your toilet, just think how you're feeding farmers in Nevada, because all that sewage is given to Nevada and they grow extra crops. So despite that sewage exportation, there was still runoff from the watershed, from the change of the trees and the roads. And this is the data graph you saw yesterday, okay, on that video, first video. This is the 60s, this is near present day. They still measure algal growth 10 days, every 10 to 15 days at UC Davis, and they continue to show that algae grows. This is Dr. Goldman's first studies. But can you imagine if they had sewage in here? It would be very steep. So this is all coming from runoff, just changes in the watershed. That secular clarity that's being measured is also declining over time. Very steep at the beginning, and less steep today. Part of the reason for this is these guys also helped create this agency, the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, to try to slow down growth in the basin and put some restrictions on it between the states of California and Nevada. So you see some of that stabilization of the clarity because of the stabilization of development.
Excuse me, the Reagan senator is the same as Ronald Reagan? Or?
Yes, exactly. So for those of you who know U.S. history, Ronald Reagan was the California governor and later became president of the United States for 8 years in the 80s. Yeah. So more conservative at that time, but in his governorship was very much a pro-environmental control in the 70s. Good question. So here's the clarity. What causes the loss of clarity? What particles? What type? Small particles mostly, but what are the small particle types?
Mud,
Clays,
Clays. You learned that yesterday.
sun,
Clays and sand, fine sand. So what are these types of particles in chemistry? Are they alive or dead? Dead. So we'll call these inorganic particles in chemistry. Okay, what else is causing the
The
decline
growth
of
of
clarity?
algae.
What now?
The growth of algae.
Algae. Algae, we'll call these phytoplankton because they're technically in the open water. We call them phytoplankton. These are organic. So a lot of the research that we've tried to do is to try to figure out, well, what are the particles and how much contribute? And it turns out, approximately, for the clarity decline, on average in 1 year, about 60% of the decline is due to inorganic from the watershed. And then the watershed contributes nutrients that grow algae. About 40% of the particles that can reduce the clarity are algae, on average. So you have to do both. You have to control nutrients and you have to control
Okay.
algae. Sediment, excuse me. So what causes the open water algae to grow? What type of nutrients do you think?
The phosphorus and the nitrogen.
Phosphorus and nitrogen, exactly. So what grows algae? Nitrogen and phosphorus, mostly. Okay, that's good news. You have phosphorus, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Do you think, I love gardening. Who loves gardening? Raise your hand, proudly. I'm a gardener. Woohoo! I love gardening. When you garden in your home, do you just add one type of nutrient, or do you try to get a good mixture in the soil?
No.
Yeah, you try to alternate, you try to get a good mixture of different elements.
According to the demand of the plant also.
Exactly. So what happens is, it's not just one nutrient or another. For you chemists out there, because I like chemistry, it turns out you need 16 elements of phosphorus for one nitrogen for you to grow algae. You need this ratio. It's the same reason we have fertilizer. It's not just nitrogen, it's a mix of nitrogen and some smaller elements. Potassium for terrestrial plants, yeah. So in Lake Tahoe, historically, to grow algae, you would have needed optimally 16 nitrogens to 1 phosphorus. But the geology of Lake Tahoe is granitic. It's very poor nutrients. The granite nutrients are very poor in nitrogen. So if you added nitrogen, you'd grow algae. So what happened is Charles Goldman did these studies, and he showed 60s to 81, mostly whenever you added nitrogen, you'd grow algae. Sometimes phosphorus, but mostly nitrogen. But after 82, okay, whenever you added phosphorus, which comes from the sediments from the watershed, you always grew algae, almost always. Probability was higher. So this shows you the demand of the elements changed from 1982 onward before 1981. What changes the demand of elements? You have to ask about the sources of nutrients. In Tahoe in the wintertime, here, we used to have lots of atmospheric pollution. Wood-burning stoves, the cities were producing energy, they're producing a lot of coal was in the region at that time. You get a lot of this type of pollution where you can't see across the lake. Maybe this happens in your area too, I don't know. But this pollution has a lot of nitrogen in it. And you can flip the nutrients needed for growth if you have atmospheric loading of nitrogen. Car pollution has nitrous oxide, climate gas. Wood burning pollution has nitrogen and phosphorus, but a lot of nitrogen. So it used to be the algae was grown by 16 to 1 algae. This is called the Redfield ratio, for those of you that are interested in the science. The optimal growth needed to grow algae. And now today, you get a lot of nutrients in. So you're getting about 4 to 1 nitrogen to phosphorus, and so you now need more phosphorus to grow. Now the good news behind this is phosphorus mostly comes from the soils. So if you can protect the watershed now, you can protect some of the algae growth. That's a